Ring-a-ling-a-ling, y'all. It's Sabbath School time, and I am here to help teachers and front row students think creatively and critically so that you all can get the most out of your class. Now, when the class doesn't prepare, when you ask softball questions and go off on tangents, everybody loses, okay? So don't be a Sabbath School loser. Today, we're prepping for the January 11th, 2020 lesson called From Jerusalem to Babylon. Let's go. Let's start with Sabbath. Something to be aware of here. One of the traits of apocalyptic literature is moral polarization. It's the beast and the lamb. It's always clear in apocalyptic literature where the line is between right and wrong. Now, that makes it really easy to kind of idealize these stories. We don't see any of Daniel's faults, for instance. He always seems to know what to do. He always has the answer. And the theological point in these stories is that God can help you navigate a cutthroat, compromising world. But don't be deceived at how clear Daniel makes these situations. Daniel lived in a storm. It was not easy. And I appreciated this line in the lesson. We are so used to stories that stress the faithfulness of Daniel and his friends that we may forget to exalt the faithfulness of the one who guided and sustained these four young men as they confronted the power and allure of the Babylonian Empire. Power and allure. Beautifully written, D'Souza. Nice job. Sunday. Daniel begins with exile and defeat, but notice the language of Daniel 1:2. It says, the Lord delivered King Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. God orchestrated Israel's defeat. The author of 2 Kings 24:20 believes God did this as punishment for Israel's sins. In his words, God finally threw them out of his presence. And yet, even in God's anger, even in their punishment, we have a man that God is blessing. There's a lot of complex emotions in this first chapter of Daniel. I mean, the conventional wisdom in the ancient world is that if we go to war and we beat you, then our God is better than your God. And God knows people are going to think that he's a loser because he let his people go into exile. But God plans to go into exile with his people and begin working in Babylon, which is really cool. Now, D'Souza wants us to adopt this theological reading of history, that God is at work behind the scenes. Things aren't what they seem when you read the newspapers. And also, when you read Daniel 10, you notice that God's sovereignty doesn't mean he micromanages people like little pawns on a chessboard. The truth is actually messier. We are working and God is working, and our working doesn't negate God's sovereignty, and God's working doesn't deny us our freedom. And this is a topic we're going to return to over and over and over again. Now, at the end of Sunday, there's a personal question about challenges we face, and it's a soft question, okay? Consider this question instead. How do you know when God is working behind the scenes, and how do you know when it's just human beings doing human? In the case of Nebuchadnezzar invading Israel, it was actually both, and that's worth thinking about in your class. On to Monday, where the lesson asks us to consider the pressures on Daniel to compromise his identity in Babylon. Babylon wanted to make Daniel Babylonian. They changed his name from Daniel, meaning God is my judge, to Belteshazzar, meaning something like, may Bel protect the king, Bel being a Babylonian god. And Daniel understood the subtle ways dominant cultures try to erase the identities of minorities. There's a lot of pressure to kind of conform to the larger way of doing things. Something as seemingly innocent as a name change or a change of diet or teaching them the dominant language. My great-grandfather, for instance, was from Mexico, but it only took 2 generations for us to stop speaking Spanish, to lose sight of our family in Mexico in all the ways and things we used to celebrate, because the pressure was to blend into the larger American culture. We went from Mexicans living in America to Americans who used to be from Mexico. Babylon's forced assimilation was a crueler kind of conquest, a second conquest. It was an attempt to make the entire world Babylonian. Who you used to be does not exist. You are now Babylonian. Now, changing names in the Bible is significant, like when God changes Jacob's name to Israel. Only your parents and your God had the right to name or rename you. In other words, your creators. So when Babylon renames Daniel, it's as if it is saying, I am your new creator, so you owe me obedience and worship as you would your parents and your God. And Daniel probably had conflicting feelings about this. I mean, it's like immigrating from rural Iowa to New York City. Part of you resists the city. It's expensive, it's fast, it's just very different. And another part of you embraces the opportunities and experiences you only get in a big city. Did Daniel feel the same way? Daniel adapted to Babylon, but he didn't assimilate. We know Daniel's friends by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? But we call Daniel by his Hebrew name because Daniel was careful to use his Hebrew name over and over and over again in his book, even though when the Babylonians are talking to Daniel in his book, they use Belteshazzar. Daniel's book, especially since most of it was written in Hebrew, was a way of preserving his identity. It was a way of resisting Babylon's efforts to erase his history by remembering, even while he served Babylon faithfully. And there are no easy answers in Daniel. It's a wonderfully textured, emotionally rich book. And let's be careful not to take the name change too far, however, because Esther had no problem referring to herself as Esther later on. The author of Esther didn't call herself Hadassah in the book. The goal in that book was to conceal your Hebrew identity. Maybe that's because Hadassah was a woman? I don't know. But let's not idealize Daniel's approach, because both he and Hadassah approached exile very differently, and both stayed faithful to their people and their God. On to Tuesday, where we face Daniel's first trial, whether he should eat the king's food or not. Now, to eat from the king's table was considered a great honor by many people, right? You don't have to go out and work for your food. Someone's feeding you. And Daniel doesn't make it clear exactly what he is objecting to. D'Souza gives us the two most likely reasons Daniel refused. Either they were unclean foods that he couldn't eat because of the law of Moses, or else the food was offered to idols. And if Daniel's concern was unclean food, then his desire to eat only vegetables had nothing to do with thinking that vegetarianism is an ideal diet. It's just the only food he could eat. It's like going to a steakhouse and saying, I don't eat meat. I'm just going to eat the mashed potatoes and the green beans. It's not that he idealized the mashed potatoes and the green beans. It's just that's what he had to eat. Now, perhaps it had nothing to do with unclean food. Perhaps the problem was that the meat was offered to Babylon's gods. Personally, I think that's less likely, since Daniel apparently didn't fight being named after Babylon's gods or studying astrology and all that stuff. I think it's more likely that Daniel's problem was unclean meat, because we see in chapter 10 and verse 3 that Daniel was in mourning, and it says that he refused to eat meat. Does that suggest that somewhere between Daniel 1 and Daniel 10, Daniel began eating meat, and so he stopped eating it again in Daniel 10? If so, it seems more likely that the royal chefs began cooking clean meat than that they stopped offering it to idols. Whatever the reason, Daniel knew what to allow and what to resist. He set up a test for 10 days, not because he wasn't sure if his plan would work, but because a short test made it easier for the officer to allow Daniel to do it. Daniel wasn't just some stubborn mule, kill me or let me do this diet. He was a master of bending but not breaking. Daniel isn't classified as wisdom literature like the Proverbs, but it's clear wisdom is a key ingredient behind Daniel's success. It's the only way to know how to stay faithful in such a fluid, hostile environment. Okay, on the Wednesday, we see here that after 10 days, Daniel and his friends looked better than anyone else in their class. A healthy diet doesn't work that fast, okay? If you haven't noticed, it's a new year, and if you're 10 days into it, well, you get it. There's clearly some supernatural help here. This faithfulness to God led them to looking healthier and wiser than the rest of their class, and give their diet a tiny bit of credit. But mostly it's their faithfulness to God. The irony here is that even though Babylon thinks it knows best, it's only because Daniel insisted on remaining so Hebrew that Babylon is blessed by his service. Now, before we move on, I want to say how much I love D'Souza's point that both Daniel and the holy sacrifices were described as without blemish. And so Daniel is a kind of living sacrifice for God there in Babylon. Just beautiful. Good point. Okay, Thursday. We've made it to Thursday, and it's time for Daniel's final exam. And Daniel and his friends, they graduate from Babylon University, summa cum laude. We have to resist a kind of purist reading of Daniel, okay? When Daniel passed this test, he was tested in Babylon's language, their religion, astrology, their literature, okay? Daniel studied that stuff hard. And today we have Christians like, well, you can't read that. It's not an Adventist book or not a Christian book. Well, Daniel read those books. And Daniel was deeply educated in Babylon's worldview and Babylon's values. You can learn something without believing it, folks. And as a result of God and Daniel's own diligence, his test scores were some of the best Babylon had ever seen. Daniel didn't sit there and say, this Babylonian stuff is rubbish. I'm just going to learn as little as possible just so I can get a passing grade and get through this. No. Daniel mastered Babylonian knowledge better than most of the Babylonians. Daniel wasn't some insecure believer, constantly insecure about being exposed to paganism. No, he mastered a knowledge of paganism and still didn't lose himself. And that's what we should be learning, folks. Not how to hide from this world, but how to master it, how to be the best, how to be excellent without giving in. And we have these neat flipping of the script in Daniel 1 because it begins with Babylon conquering Judah and it ends with Daniel conquering Babylon. And that's why chapter 1 ends by talking about how Daniel lived until the time of the Persians. In other words, Daniel outlasted Babylon. Whew, what a lesson. We'll see you next week. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Study hard, and I hope you have a great class.